Lauri Markkanen was one of the biggest pieces on the NBA trade market last offseason, but then he signed a contract extension in Utah that meant he couldn't be traded. Until now, the Jazz are actively looking for Lauri Markkanen trades, and in an offseason where a bunch of other stars are also rumored to be available, Markkanen is a pretty underrated player as a massive trade piece this offseason. So what exactly is the situation in Utah with the Jazz and Markkanen? Well, last year, for the first time in a couple years, they really tanked. They haven't been good in a couple years, but last year was the first time where they actively tried to be really bad, to the point that they were getting fined by the league. Markkanen barely played, most of their best players barely played, and it didn't work out for them. They fell in the lottery, and they are definitely at a pivot point in terms of where they're going within this rebuild after trading away Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert a few seasons ago. And it's clear that Markkanen is very good, but his timeline probably doesn't match up with the rest of the team's timeline, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. We know that there was interest around the league in trading for him. Most specifically, the Warriors almost traded for him a year ago before waiting. They also tried to get Paul George before waiting, and then ultimately getting Jimmy Butler mid-season. But given that those conversations were had, it's clear that Utah would be willing to trade away Lauri Markkanen to get some nice new pieces to continue their rebuild, because frankly, outside of Markkanen, there's a bunch of okay pieces on this roster, Walker Kessler, whatever you think about Keontae George, but there's no other real keepers outside of Markkanen, so it's probably going to be a little bit before they can actually be a good team. And I'd also assume that Markkanen himself would like to maybe win some basketball games at some point, rather than just kind of wasting away in Utah for the rest of his prime. So it's clear that the Jazz would be willing to trade Markkanen and that there would be a market, but there are a couple of issues with a potential trade. First and foremost, you have to have a kind of defensive infrastructure around Markkanen that would work, because presumably if you're trading for him, you would like to either compete or semi-compete, and you can't do that well enough if you don't have a good defensive infrastructure around him. He's not a completely terrible defender, but you need a good rim protector alongside him. You're not going to be able to survive with him playing the 5 very much at all, and you need some good wings to make up for his lack of foot speed at times on the perimeter. The other problem with trading for him, at least in terms of the Jazz getting value in exchange, is that he just hasn't played a whole lot lately. Like I said, they basically benched him for half the season last year, and he just signed this big new contract, so he's probably not worth as much now as he was last offseason, just because teams haven't really seen him play all that much lately. And it's not like he's a guy that has a bunch of all-NBA teams to his pedigree, to his resume. He's clearly very good, but this isn't like a superstar kind of player that you are trading for. So what are the options out there? Well, first and foremost is one that I've seen people talk about a bunch, and that is Lauri Markkanen to the Philadelphia 76ers. In this trade construction, it would be Paul George and the 3rd overall pick going back to Utah in exchange for Markkanen. In this scenario, the Jazz get another top 5 pick, a higher pick than the one that they have that is their own, and they're going to be able to use those 2 picks and really start to build something foundational in Utah outside of Lauri Markkanen. And amongst all of these trades, the 3rd overall pick in this draft is by far the best trade asset that they are going to get in these deals, because like I said, his value is a little bit lower than where it was last offseason. And for Philly, this deal makes a bunch of sense for a couple of reasons. One, Markkanen is one of the few real difference maker kind of guys that they could probably realistically get with the 3rd overall pick in this draft. There's been speculation that they would try and trade the 3rd overall pick, but it's more difficult than you'd think to actually get someone that matters and would help you try and contend when you're trading away a top draft pick. Just ask the Portland Trailblazers a couple of years ago when they had Damian Lillard. They were trying to trade the pick they ultimately used on Scoot Henderson to anybody that would take it, and they couldn't find a piece they felt like was worth it. But this is actually something that would work for Philadelphia, because Markkanen fits in both Embiid's timeline, because he can help you win next year, and he fits within the younger guys' timeline, guys like Jared McCain and Tyrese Maxey, and then obviously you're trading away a young guy asset here with the 3rd overall pick. I think right now this is one of the more realistic Lauri Markkanen trades out there. It depends on if Philly wants to trade the pick. It depends on how much they like Markkanen alongside Joel Embiid in the front court. And of course, it depends on if the Jazz think that it is worth it to not only trade Markkanen, but take on the contract of Paul George in exchange for just the 3rd overall pick in this draft, which would be potentially Ace Bailey, VJ Edgecombe, someone like that. Because even though you would, in theory, be able to flip Paul George potentially in a year or at the trade deadline for some other assets, or maybe even within the same offseason, he has arguably one of the worst contracts in the entire league. And if you were to try and rehab some of that value, you'd have to actually play Paul George, which would mean winning games, which obviously is not their goal for next season. So it's complicated for each side, but I think as Markkanen trades go in terms of contenders, it is certainly one of the most interesting. The next team that I thought about when I was trying to find Lauri Markkanen trades was the Minnesota Timberwolves. In this trade, it would be Julius Randle, Mike Conley, Rob Dillingham, and the 17th pick in the 2025 draft going to Utah in exchange for Markkanen. First and foremost, Julius Randle would have to opt into his contract to make this work. We've talked about Minnesota trades a bunch already this offseason. I'll put some of those other videos in the card at the top of the screen here, but essentially this would require Julius Randle to opt in, and that would seem relatively unlikely if he knows he's opting in to just go and play for the Jazz, unless the Jazz are like, hey, once you get here, we'll just buy you out. We're not worried about having Julius Randle on the team. We would just want him there to make the salaries work in this trade construction. You could also reroute Julius Randle to the third team. The value here for Utah is Rob Dillingham, and it's that first round pick. Obviously, Minnesota, given what they gave up to move up in the draft to get Dillingham last year, does not want to give up on this guy so early, I would assume, but Markkanen is a pretty good fit for them in the front court, and I don't think the 17th overall pick is something that they are really valuing all that much in exchange for someone like Markkanen. You have that defensive infrastructure there that we talked about earlier with McDaniels on the wing, Gobert in the front court, and that core group of Anthony Edwards, McDaniels, Markkanen, and Gobert would be really, really formidable and give them a little bit of extra boost of offense that they desperately need, that Randle kind of was at times for them this year, but I think Markkanen would fit better along their timeline, better as a floor spacer, and would kind of fill the Karl Anthony Towns role, at least offensively, but he's significantly cheaper and potentially a little bit of a better fit defensively, depending on how they use him there in Minnesota. I'm not sure how excited they would be to add Markkanen. I don't know how much of a target he is for them, but at least from a salary and asset perspective, they do have a deal they can put together to make this work if Utah would be interested in essentially Rob Dillingham and a mid-first round pick in exchange for Markkanen. That might not feel like a lot. Minnesota might think it's too much because they probably really value Dillingham, and you have to really take into account, does Utah need another guard? Like, do they need someone else to go and take a ton of shots for them? Is Dillingham really a foundational piece? A lot of moving pieces here, but I think it is a construction that would be interesting, again, if Randle agrees to go to Utah and then maybe be bought out. He has to opt into the contract. A lot of things happening there. The next team that I thought about, though, was the Portland Trailblazers, a team that I'm really intrigued by what their plan could possibly be this offseason, because they were trending up towards the end of the season in a way that I don't think a lot of people noticed, and I think they are potentially in play for a nice little mini leap next season, maybe even a play-in team, maybe even just an outright playoff team, because they've got some really good young pieces, and Markkanen would be the kind of offensive boost that they would need. They've got a big contract in DeAndre Ayton, they've got another little contract here in Matisse Thybulle, and the 11th overall pick in this draft. Could those three assets together be enough to get Utah to part from Lauri Markkanen? That might not seem like a lot, but again, his value is probably lower than it was last offseason, and that gives Portland a star to build around. You've got a bunch of other complementary pieces, young pieces that are continuing to grow, and you don't really need DeAndre Ayton anymore. You've got Donovan Clingan, you've got some other bigs there that Markkanen could play really well alongside, and as a semi-foundational piece, I really like the concept of Lauri Markkanen in Portland. There's been some other trades out there for Portland, like maybe them adding someone like Domantas Sabonis. That kind of trade construction to me makes a lot of sense for a Portland team that doesn't just want to try and win 35 games again next year, wants to try and make a little bit of a step forward, and this isn't all that much to be giving up in exchange for a player in Markkanen that is not only young, fits their timeline, but also is signed long-term, so they have to worry about him possibly leaving in free agency. For Utah, you're probably not all that excited about DeAndre Ayton. Maybe you try to flip him to another team. Matisse Thybulle is fine. It's really about the 11th overall pick. They'd probably ask for more draft compensation here as a result, but the upside for them is it immediately gets them out of the Markkanen contract, or at least it would next offseason, because both of these deals, Ayton and Tybulle's, are expiring deals, and they'd sign Markkanen to the contract once they wouldn't lose him in free agency this offseason, but also just to retain the asset and then move him for something else, and that's exactly what they're doing here while also getting out of the salary, so it's a little bit more beneficial than some of the other trades that we have talked about. Those, to me, feel like the three most realistic teams in terms of Lauri Markkanen trades, but you can see some of the difficulty in actually finding a team. There's a couple of different things that have to come together for this to really happen, but I think that it ultimately could be a mystery team. There's a bunch of teams that actually could put together a realistic trade structure in exchange for Lauri Markkanen, and this is a domino that most people just are not talking about this offseason that could really change a bunch of things as we go into next year.